morning, and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. Today, we're diving into one of the biggest mindset shifts that separates winning players from the rest. The idea that poker isn't always black and white. We all crave clear answers. Should we bet or check, call or fold? But the truth is, many situations in poker exist in a gray area where multiple decisions can be equally valid. In this episode, we'll break down when precision really matters and when obsessing over a quote correct play could actually be hurting your progress. Whether you're a GTO-focused grinder or an exploitative live player, this episode will help you identify which spots truly impact your win rate and which ones you can stop overanalyzing. By the end of this episode, you'll be thinking differently about your game and making better, more practical decisions at the table. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Black and White. If we imagine that the average poker player is put to a decision in a hand of poker, should they bet, should they call, what is the correct play? We find that there is a desire, generally, for a specific, concrete conclusion. In other words, I'm facing a bet. Categorically, we want to know whether we should be calling or whether we should be folding or raising, for example. The truth is, however, that many situations are not that black and white. In many cases, we can actually take multiple actions and it doesn't necessarily affect our EV. We see that in theory land. Many hands are mixed strategy in theory, which means they take all available options with some frequency. But we also find that in practice, many hands should be mixed as well. Let's take a simple example. Imagine the following. We raise first in from the button. Let's say that it's a 6 max, 100 big blinds, online cash game. We open raise the button, big blind cold calls. We see a flop of Jack 9-3 rainbow, and we have 10-9 offsuit. What would you do in that situation? Would you fire a continuation bet, or would you check back? Now let me ask you the same question for another hand. Ace-9 offsuit. So still a pair of nines, we have a better kicker. Would you c-bet or would you check in that situation? Now, for some players, this might seem like a black and white question. They may say things like, well, I would always bet the ace-9 offsuit, has a better kicker. I would always check the 10-9, for example. Or it may be black and white with a different answer. For example, I always just check all second pair type hands in this spot. Or perhaps you always bet second pair type hands in this spot. When we take a look at theory, we see that this situation is not black and white. It's actually somewhat of a gray area. For example, if we take 10-9 offsuit, according to theory, it should likely bet around 20% of the time, which means it should be checking 80%, whereas ace-9 bets 50%, checks 50%. Now, of course, those frequencies are not necessarily precise. It depends on the tree that you've used for your solver output. Having said that, we can see that these strategies are clearly mixed. The solver is telling us that the EV between a bet and a check is exactly the same. If you were to always bet or always check all of our 9x, it shouldn't technically change our win rate. Of course, it does generate an imbalance in our strategy. If our opponent was good enough to figure out that we didn't have enough 9x hands when we check, or we didn't have enough 9x hands when we bet, then our opponent could generate a counter exploit against that. So technically our EV could drop if we don't play a balanced strategy and our opponent exploits us. But assuming that's a shade too advanced for the average opponent, it actually doesn't matter whether we bet or check. So we can think about the question, how accurate do we really need to be with this? We know that we're supposed to mix, but does it really matter if we bet 10-9 offsuit exactly 20% and check 80% of the time? What would happen if we still mixed across the entire category of 9x, but we made individual 9x combos with pure strategy? What do I mean by that? For example, what if we were to always check back if we had a 10-9 offsuit, but always bet if we have an ace-9 offsuit? It's true that that strategy is still technically imbalanced, but we can have 9x regardless of whether we bet or whether we check. It's going to be even harder to exploit. The main takeaway here is that this is not a black and white part of the game. Our EV doesn't really change that much whether we bet or whether we check. It may be helpful to have some level of mixing going on with our 9x combos, but even if we never mixed our 9x and always bet or always checked, unless we're playing against very high level opposition, it's not really going to have an impact on our overall win rate. The danger here is if we start obsessing over the situation and imagining it is black and white. You can imagine two players getting into a debate regarding exactly which 9x should bet and which should check. One player might say something like, you should always just c-bet 9x in this spot. If you don't c-bet 9x, it's terrible. It's not that black and white. Clearly a gray area. It's really important for poker players to be able to differentiate between areas that are actually black and white, where only one option is okay, and areas where you could actually play a range of strategies and it wouldn't have too much of an impact on your expectation. And this doesn't just apply to GTO play, by the way. This applies to exploitative real-world poker play. There are still situations where we can take two different options that generate the same EV. It's not really going to make a big difference to our overall win rate. But there are some situations where it is black and white. You have to pick the right option, otherwise you're going to damage your win rate. We're going to consider some example situations. So think about the situation, see if you can figure out whether it's black or white, or whether it's more of a gray area. So thinking about our second example, imagine the following situation. Once again, we've open raised on the button. Big blind has co-called. We catch a Jack 9-3 rainbow texture. We have pocket jacks, so we've flopped top set. The action is as follows. We fire a continuation bet on the flop for 75% pot. Our opponent check calls. The turn is a 4 of diamonds, so it puts a flush draw out there. The texture is Jack 9-3 4, two-tone. We still have top set, no draws have completed yet. We decide to double barrel the turn for 125% pot. Our opponent check calls. River is the 5 of diamonds. So technically, flush is now possible. 7 high straight is possible. Also, ace deuce for the 5 high straight is possible. 6 deuce as well. Although who knows if our opponent has those combos. Question is, possible straights completed, possible flush has completed. Should we value bet the river with our pocket jacks? Top set, but draws have got there. Is it black or white, or is it a gray area? This one is a little bit closer to being black or white, but you could still just about call it a gray area. According to game theory, we should actually always value bet this river, and it's still correct to overbet the river. With the bet sizings we described, there's going to be about 48 big blinds in the middle. We have 76 remaining in the effective stack. And the solver does make use of that overbet sizing. So it just shoves 76 into the 48 big blind pot with pocket jacks, despite the fact that the flush and straight has completed. In terms of EV, the EV of betting is, according to GTO at least, 4 big blinds higher than the EV of checking. In other words, we can summarize by saying you should actually bet the river here. If we get scared because the flush and straight have completed, we're technically not making the best decision anymore. But we're only talking about 4 big blinds in this case, and I would say probably the threshold is around there somewhere. Of course, we want to maximize our win rate, but if you're only losing a big blind or two in terms of river play, may not be too big of an issue. The solver's not going to perfectly represent the actual reality of the situation anyway, and the exact EV. Anything more than about 4 big blinds, though, it starts to become black and white. You're just making a straight up mistake. So this is maybe the limit where we could still refer to something as a gray area. If we get scared and check back jacks here, it may not kill our win rate, but it's also probably not the best play. Let's move on to our next example. Example number 3. It's a very simple example. We're in the big blind this time, and we face a min raise from the button. Same setup as before, 6 max, 100 big blind stacks. We're in the big blind with king 4 suited. Do we call against the button min raise, or do we fold? Take a moment and think, what is your standard line in that scenario? Guess what? We've now entered into the territory of black and white. King 4 suited is an easy call because the expectation is almost 0.4 big blinds. Now hold on, didn't we just say that anything less than 4 big blinds is negligible? We have to put this into context. You see, we were looking at a river situation where there were 40 plus big blinds in the middle, whereas here we're talking about a very large percentage of the pot in our pre-flop scenario, because there's only a few big blinds in the middle. So 0.4 big blinds in expectation is a huge chunk of the pot. It's also worth keeping in mind that river situations are much lower frequency than pre-flop situations. So even if we lose quite a few big blinds in EV in a fairly infrequent river situation, it's potentially going to be dwarfed by even a very small loss in a high frequency pre-flop situation. That's why we can say that 0.4 big blinds in expectation when considering big blind defense, absolutely non-negotiable. This is a very clear black and white spot. The irony is that some players may miss this particular big blind defend, but then spend a large amount of time deliberating of whether they should fire a continuation bet in a certain situation where the EV is actually very close. Clearly not black and white, clearly a gray area. much better to eradicate the black and white mistakes from our game rather than deliberate for a long period of time over a grey area. Let's think about our next example. Imagine we defend out of the big blind against a button open. We face a continuation bet from our opponent. The board is King 7-3 two-tone. King of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 3 of clubs. Our opponent fires a 1/3 pot continuation bet. We check call. The turn is the 2 of hearts, fairly blankish. Our opponent fires a second bullet for 125% pot. So he's 1/3 the flop. Now he has overbet the turn. We have Queen 10 offsuit, so we don't really have too much. We only defended against the flop c-bet because it was a very small sizing and we have some backdoor equity. However, we think maybe our opponent's light. We don't really have any proof. We just get a feeling that our opponent is maybe double barreling a bit wider than usual. So we decide to take our Queen 10. We know we can't check call, so we decide to check raise as a bluff. What do you think? Is it reasonable? Is it a gray area or is it black and white? If it's black and white, which direction are we talking about? In this particular case, a GTO solver would anticipate this to be significantly losing check raise on the turn. We're talking about -5 big blinds in EV on the check raise. That's because if we have a look at theory, we should actually be check raising mostly draws in this spot, draws and better, maybe a gut shot, but we can't just take a random queen high and check raise without any equity. It's going to be a losing play. Now, we did say that we felt that our opponent might be double barreling a bit wider than usual, but the problem here is that it's not actually based on anything. It's just a feeling. And unless we can quantify that feeling, unless we can demonstrate with data, for example, or demonstrate using our opponent's HUD stats, we're basically just guessing that this might be an above average time to put in the check raise. The upshot of this is, it is black and white. This is a straight up losing check raise. Once again, you could see the irony of a player deliberating over exactly which hand to c-bet the flop with, but then every so often spewing 5 big blinds in EV with a 0 equity turn check raise. This is black and white. It's an example of something that has to be eradicated from our game if we want to generate a positive win rate. Okay, let's consider another example. Example number 5. So we've raised first in on the button. Big blind is the cold caller. We're keeping these examples fairly similar to make it a bit more straightforward. The board texture is King 9-3 two-tone, King of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 3 of clubs. We have pocket aces, so we've flopped an overpair, and we decide to fire both flop and turn. The sizing plan is as follows: 1/3 pot on the flop, but then 125% pot overbet on the turn. The turn is the 2 of hearts, so fairly blankish, and the river is the 3 of spades. So we have King 9-3, deuce turn, 3 on the river, no flush or straight draw completing. We still have pocket aces, so we have an overpair still on the river. In fact, we technically have aces and trays with king kicker, but we can think about that as just being an overpair. Our opponent checks to us. Question is, should we value bet here or should we just check back? So take a moment to think about that. Now, according to theory, checking is a huge mistake. The EV of checking relative to the EV of value betting is almost 10 big blinds. It's just under, around about 9 big blind in expectation. Now, the reason why we say roundabout is because it does depend on the sizing that we use here on the river. The EV will change slightly. But the key takeaway here is that if the EV difference between betting and checking is almost 10 big blinds, then this is not really a gray area. This is absolute black and white. You have to fire the third street of value with your aces. And it's very easy to look at this when we're not emotionally involved in a hand. But we can also imagine ways that players may begin to rationalize a check back here. King 9-3, deuce 3, well, trips is completed on the river. Players may also convince themselves that they're entering into a deep thought process and may think things like, well, my opponent has all of these busted queen 10, queen jack, 10 jack gut shots. He's not going to call with those. And he may not pay out 3 streets with a king X. So it's quite hard to extract value here. I may mostly end up being called by better hands if I try and triple barrel in this scenario. Maybe my opponent slow played trips. Maybe he rivered a 3 somehow. Again, this doesn't sound irrational. We can imagine a player thinking that. It maybe sounds a bit tight, but it doesn't sound irrational. And everything we said about the gut shot is fairly true. Our opponent's not going to be calling with queen jack high on the river, and he may decide to check raise bluff. That could be tricky for us if that happens. Having said that, this spot's black and white. We have to fire the third street for value here. Now, the reason why we talk about these areas is many players end up losing because they're making big mistakes in black and white areas. We don't know the exact number of players that are losing, but we know that the percentage is high. Could, for example, be well over 90% of players who play poker end up losing in the long run. The question is, why do they end up losing? Is it because they're not quite mixing their ranges in some type of close flop situation? In most cases, the answer is no. The real reason is that those players are misplaying in black and white situations. There are a number of very core mistakes that they're making. Missing big blind defense, missing value bets on the river. They may not realize that's the reason that they're losing. They may think the reason that they're losing is to do with some advanced concept. They just need to spend more time working with solver output. They may think that's why they're losing, but actually you'll find when you dig into the strategy that there are some fundamental black and white errors being made. We've just looked at a few examples. There are other broad categories that we can list of the types of fairly common, more common than you might expect, mistakes that are made in black and white territories. The first one, calling without pot odds, especially on the turn. It's ironic that pot odds, it's usually one of the first things that poker players learn about. If you want to get good at poker, you learn about odds and outs. So players usually spend a week or so learning pot odds in poker, trying to apply it. And then after that, they just forget about the existence of pot odds and just make all of their decisions based on feel. I think I probably have the right price with that flush draw. I'm just going to call. All of the calculation goes out of the window. It seems to me that most pot odds mistakes occur on the turn. Why do I specifically say the turn? Well, on the flop, there's usually some post-flop playability factors still to be involved in the hand, unless you're all in on the flop. And the other thing is, even if you are all in on the flop, you still have two streets, which usually means you have a bigger chunk of equity with your draws anyway. The turn, we usually find our opponent is more likely to be all in, and we only have one card to come. So it's a very, very common mistake that players simply call turn all-ins without getting the right price. And maybe they even know on some level that they don't quite get the right price with their flush draw, but they can't bear folding, knowing that if the gin card does hit on the river, then they're going to win the entire pot. Very, very common black and white mistake. We know it's black and white because it's basic math. If you're getting 30% pot odds and your flush draw is only going to hit around 18% and you call in that situation, it's just straight up losing. Some of the biggest black and white spots don't occur in GTO territory. For example, missing bluffs versus huge overfolders. Imagine we had an opponent who folds 70% of the time against a triple barrel on the river. We have an air-type hand and we decide not to pull a trigger on a bluff. Well, that's black and white. GTO might imply that that particular bluff combo is mixed and you can sometimes bluff or sometimes check. GTO might even say that that combo is a pure check based on blocking effects. However, if your opponent's folding 70% and you don't bluff, that's a clear black and white mistake. Categorically, we should have bet in that scenario. Other similar examples include bluffing against calling stations. It doesn't matter that GTO says your river hand has great blockers. If your opponent is only folding the river 20% of the time against your pot size bet, that's not going to be profitable. That's a black and white mistake. Bluff catching against severe underbluffers. I know my opponent is a huge nit and he's never bluffed before, but I'm blocking the nut straight in this situation. Therefore, I should bluff catch. Solver might agree with you, but that's a clear mistake. It's black and white. You should be folding in that scenario. Overfolding versus overbluffers. This one's a bit trickier. It goes against our natural intuition, or at least it goes against the natural intuition of some of us, which is to bluff catch very wide against aggression from our opponents. Perhaps our opponent's overbetting the river, for example, and we just have a pure bluff catcher. But when we check the data that we've collated on our opponent, we see that he's bluffing 40 or 50% of the time with that specific sizing. It starts to become black and white. Folding a bluff catcher against someone who is significantly over bluffing is going to be a fairly large EV mistake. So you can see, although we do find EV mistakes in GTO territory, there are some hands which clearly have to be defended or clearly have to be value bet. But we find even larger mistakes in the territory of exploitative play. So what are the key takeaways in this discussion on black and white? The first takeaway is don't obsess over gray areas. The thing is, in order to not obsess over gray areas, we have to be able to identify the gray areas in the first place. Sometimes that takes experience. Working with solvers can help us to understand as well which areas are very important, which areas are not so important. If something is heavily mixed on an earlier street, there's a chance that it's going to be a gray area for us as well. Most of the big exploitative opportunities are going to occur on the turn and especially the river. But if a flop situation is heavily mixed according to solver, there's a good chance it's a gray area. You probably don't want to obsess over that. Another takeaway is to try and think of EV as a spectrum rather than black or white, which is how many players tend towards thinking about their decisions. A situation's either a call or it's a fold. but we should broaden that understanding of what's involved here. Is it a clear call? Is it a slightly plus EV call? Is it very gray area / mixed call? Is it slightly losing? Is it moderately losing? Is it significantly losing? There's a whole spectrum there. We don't want to think in terms of binary. That's how players end up becoming dogmatic over areas that really aren't that important because there's only two answers in their head. It's either a call or it's a fold. And it's good to be opinionated. It's good to have a strong feeling that a certain decision is the best decision. But those strong feelings should revolve around black and white zones. There's no point being pedantic over a play that's not going to change our EV in the long run. We want to shift as much of our attention as possible to prioritizing important zones, the clear black and white mistakes. We've listed some examples in this session. On the flip side, we don't want to obsess over gray areas. If we understand that a certain situation is mixed, not too important for our overall win rate, we can relax in those zones. We understand that it's probably okay if we bet, it's also okay if we check. So this podcast episode is really about shifting our focus toward nodes that actually generate a significant part of our win rate. And what we often find is if a player is playing perfectly well in all of the black and white areas, that's usually enough to generate a very positive win rate, even if some of the gray areas are, let's just say, not fully optimized. And that's why we have so many different styles of poker, by the way. That's why we have two players who seemingly have very different styles, but they both make money. It's because when you analyze the black and white areas, the very important zones, both of those players are going to be nailing the decision every time. Whereas everything in the middle, the gray areas, it's not really worth obsessing over that. Poker is simply just not that black and white in many zones. All right, thanks very much for listening, guys. Hope you found it interesting. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. If you want to go even deeper into the topics we discussed here, I highly recommend grabbing the Advanced Poker Workbook. This workbook takes you through the concepts that massively impact your win rate with heaps of side-by-side exploration of GTO versus exploitative plays. With over 1,300 questions, your off-table study is mapped out for you. Plus, it comes with a complete answer key and a video course showing you how to do every single section. If you're ready to study advanced concepts the right way between sessions, so the info actually sticks in and is usable for you at the tables, visit redchippoker.com/advanced today and get your copy. Again, redchippoker.com/advanced. Or grab it off Amazon if you prefer paperback copies, links for both in the description. Until next time, good luck out there and happy grinding.